Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio touches down in Saudi Arabia for high-profile peace talks to end the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, European leaders hold emergency discussions in Paris as they react to the US diplomatic strategy on the conflict. The UK government confirms Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer will head to Washington next week to meet with US President Donald Trump. And President Zelensky will travel to Saudi Arabia this week, days after his trip to the UAE, as he demands a seat at the negotiation table. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. Iran will not hesitate to defend its nuclear program, according to Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson. The comments come a day after Israel and the US vowed to counter Iran's nuclear ambitions and its influence in the Middle East. Ismail Bagheri said the country will not show any weakness based on their rights as a member in the non-treaty of the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has triggered a huge explosion at a construction site in the capital Pyongyang. Mr. Kim made a speech to crowds on Sunday before turning a switch to ignite an explosion. The 16th of February is the North Korean leader's birthday, which is celebrated as a national holiday called the Day of the Shining Star. Pope Francis is facing a complex clinical picture, according to the Vatican, and will remain in hospital. The pontiff was admitted to Rome's Gemelli Hospital on Friday for treatment following a bronchitis diagnosis. The Vatican revealed tests pick up a polymicrobial infection of the respiratory tract, but that he is remaining in good humor. And Colombian singer Shakira has been forced to cancel her concerts in Peru after experiencing an abdominal issue. The four-time Grammy Award winner was due to perform in Lima for the first time in 10 years. She told fans doctors were taking good care of her. Let's go to Paris now, where European leaders have met in the French capital for an emergency summit on the Ukraine war after President Donald Trump's envoy said Europe will not be part of peace negotiations. There are growing concerns Trump's push to end the conflict directly with Russia has left Europe and Kyiv isolated. We can now cross live to Paris to speak to our correspondent there, Cullen. Ross, thank you so much for joining me this evening. First of all, European leaders are facing criticism for appearing to ignore warning signs that Trump would potentially sideline them. They're also being accused of scrambling together to react to his call with Putin last week, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely, Leigh Ann. Good evening. No doubt that there has been a scrambled effort over the weekend, this hastily arranged summit taking place right now here in the centre of the French capital at the Élysée Palace. European leaders are extremely worried about what you mentioned, the fact that they could be sidelined in the negotiations to try to end the war in Ukraine. A worst case scenario for Europe would to be a bilateral peace agreement between Washington and Moscow without taking into account any of the interests of Kiev, without Ukraine being at the table, and for that to be a disadvantageous deal imposed on Ukraine with no European influence whatsoever. So they are trying to avoid that. They have got together as soon as possible on Monday after the conclusion of the Munich Security Conference to try to come up with a consensus, this agreed position, a rapidly agreed position after the speech by J.D. Vance, the US Vice President, blindsided them at the Munich Security Conference. Those discussions ongoing now to see if they can come up with an agreed position on how to try to influence the negotiations to end the war.
Yes, indeed. And President Trump and Macron actually spoke before the summit. Will that conversation basically set the tone for discussions that are going on right now in Paris?
Yeah, the French president and the US president spoke for about 20 minutes, Leigh Ann, and that conversation did take place before the European government leaders arrived here in Paris for the summit. So that certainly is going to be very important for the European government leaders to be informed by Emmanuel Macron, the contents of that conversation, to what ends he managed to influence Donald Trump's position in terms of the Saudi Arabia summit that's upcoming between the US government position and also the Russian foreign minister and the Russian top foreign affairs advisor as well, meeting at ministerial level in Riyadh on Tuesday. That's the first level to try to lay the groundwork for a possible Trump-Putin meeting. Well, Emmanuel Macron will have been speaking to Donald Trump this afternoon to try to understand more of that positioning. Donald Trump says he doesn't want to forget about Ukraine. He says he has been informing Volodymyr Zelensky of the US's position throughout all of this, but Emmanuel Macron will also have conveyed European concern to Donald Trump that a lot of this is proceeding without Ukraine being at the forefront, without Ukraine having a primary position in the negotiations. You could argue the US says, well, we're going to speak to Russia and then Ukraine and then try to get Russia and Ukraine together in the same room. Well, Europe would have liked to have seen the US speak to Ukraine first, say that if the country has been invaded, then they should be listened to first, after that potentially reaching out to Russia. So there's so much going on in terms of positioning, Leigh Ann, in terms of the geopolitical influence building. We have this latest, obviously the latest European position is being decided right now here in Paris.
Yes, indeed, there's a lot going on, and Russia's foreign minister has said there's no role for Europe in any peace talks. This is something, as you mentioned, Europe be really concerned about. Some are arguing this whole situation, Ross, has just highlighted how divided Europe is, and especially on things like defence spending. But what are the real main concerns now?
Yeah, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, was actually suggesting that one of the reasons why Europe would want to be at the negotiations is in order to be able to continue the war. He says it wouldn't make any sense. They wouldn't have any position at the table. They wouldn't have anything to say. They are not a direct player in this war. Europe obviously counters that by saying that this is a conflict that's taking place on the European continent. Ukraine has a border with Poland, Slovakia, Hungary and Romania. They're all EU states. They're all NATO states. Europe says that we have been contributing diplomatic support, humanitarian support, military support for Ukraine since 2022. Alongside the US, we have a huge role to play, an amazing amount of support that we've been giving to Ukraine. That has to be taken into account. Our interests have to be taken into account as well. But the fact that they've been sidelined from this latest first round of US-Russia talks does highlight also the reason why they're getting together so rapidly this evening here in Paris to try to come together to some form of agreement to overcome, as you point out, Leigh Ann, those divisions that have been apparent in Europe on how much they spend on their defence budgets, on the differing sizes of all the armies in Europe, for example, as well. So they're trying to come to some form of consensus on these issues as well, to be able to present a united front to the US, to Russia in these upcoming talks.
Yes, indeed. Ross Cullen in Paris for us. Thank you so much. Now, staying with the story, as US Secretary of State Marco Rubio is in Saudi Arabia today as the United States brokers peace talks between both Russia and Ukraine. As the war nears its third anniversary, Rubio is expected at a series of high-profile discussions in Riyadh. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman met with the US Secretary of State, as well as the National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and the Middle East Special Envoy Steve Witkoff today. We can now go live to Riyadh to speak to Al Arabiya's Washington Bureau Chief, Nadia Bilbassy-Charters. Thank you so much for joining me this evening, Nadia. First of all, how significant is Marco Rubio's visit to Saudi Arabia, and what can we expect from this week's high-profile talks?
Thank you for having me, Leigh Ann. As we speak, actually, he is meeting with the Crown Prince, and that meeting will focus on two important issues. First is what Rubio came for in the first place. This is a scheduled trip, first trip to the Middle East as Secretary of State. Rubio, as you know, he was a senator. He knows the issues very, very well. He's been working on them for decades. But he comes here to represent a new policy of President Trump regarding Gaza. He was supposed to talk about it, to listen to what the Saudis and other Arab states, Jordan, Egypt, and others are going to offer as an alternative plan, because displacing 2 million Palestinians and making Gaza a Riviera is not workable. It's not acceptable ethically, strategically, or politically to many Arab and Muslim states. And secondly, now that as we are trying to scramble to cover so many angles of these meetings, now we expecting the Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, to arrive in Riyadh. And the meeting just happened now, as I was talking to you, is also going to focus on Russia and Ukraine. And as you know, now, in addition to Rubio, as Secretary of State, we have a man that his name now has become front and center, Steve Witkoff. He was appointed as the President Envoy to the Middle East. Now we're talking about an enlarged or extended role also regarding Russia and Ukraine war and the desire by President Trump to end it as soon as possible.
Yes, lots of angles to cover for sure. But before arriving in Riyadh, Rubio actually spoke to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on the phone. And it's fair to say that he was pretty keen to downplay the current stage of talks when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. He said one phone call does not make peace. So how long is he envisioning this process to take?
It's really interesting you mentioned that and this phone call, because on the other hand, his boss, President Trump, said with the phone call, I can end this war. That was a campaign promise, if you remember. But now I think the president wants to end it very quickly. And when we talk about preparation for the summit, some believe that the fact that Sergei Lavrov himself is coming here, that means maybe we are closer to talk about in the next few days of a date for a possible summit between President Trump and President Putin with the mediation of the Saudis led by the Crown Prince. Of course, as you know, as I mentioned before, that Senator Rubio at the time was always suspicious of Russia, and his stand was very hawkish towards Putin and Moscow, unlike President Trump. But now he's serving the president, who's spent an hour and a half on a phone call with President Putin and saying that we have good chance of this working out. He's already negotiated in public, because he told us, President Trump, that we believe that Ukraine will never, well, not never, maybe it's a strong word, but they're not going to be a part of NATO. At least we're talking about the foreseeable future. And also, it's become like a foregone conclusion that Crimea will be part of Russia, and maybe certain areas, that Russian-speaking areas. So now people think that probably the loser part or the weaker part is the Ukrainians and President Zelensky, who, by the way, is coming to Riyadh on a pre-scheduled trip on Wednesday, but he's not meeting, obviously, with the Russians or with the Americans. But I think this is the first is the summit is between both sides. As you said, Rubio trying to downplay this success in the first round. And of course, it's a complicated issue and we don't expect it to happen. But the one who wants it to happen quickly is President Trump. And we will see actually maybe the success of this preparation is whether they're going to announce very soon, whether it's end of February or middle of March, that actually an actual summit between President Putin and President Trump will take place here in Riyadh.
Nadia, I also remember President Trump saying he could end the Ukraine-Russia war on the first day in office, which didn't happen either. But let's just go back. You mentioned there that Zelensky is planning to travel to Saudi Arabia this week, but he really wants to be taken seriously. When can we expect Putin to do the same thing? And what do you think Zelensky wants from these talks in Saudi Arabia?
Well, he wanted to have the Ukrainian represented with their demands. I mean, after all, Ukraine sees Russia as the aggressor. Russia is the one who invaded Ukraine. And in a way, it seems like the whole of Europe, and you spoke to your previous guest before me, talking about the French position, the German position. It seems that they're all on one side with Ukraine, and you have the American position, and the Russians are kind of closer. We will see if there is any change in this, but he's coming with his wife on Wednesday, and he wants to make sure that Ukraine won't be losing to Russian demands on so many things. He wants to have guarantees that Russia is not going to invade. And this is what Trump said. Trump said that we don't want to see another war in Ukraine or in Europe soon, because 2014, it happened when President Obama was in office, and Russia took over Crimea. And it happens again during President Biden in office, and Russia took even more. And they were hoping, if it wasn't, according to sources I spoke to in the previous administration, they believed that if it wasn't for the strong stand that the Biden administration showed and this strong alliance with NATO and other European countries, Putin would probably have it an easier way to, of course, go all the way to Kiev and maybe other Baltic states. And I think Zelensky knows, and he said publicly in Munich, by the way, a few days ago, that without American support militarily and diplomatically, it's going to be really hard for the Ukrainian to continue in this war, which everybody agrees it has to come to an end, but the question is at what expense?
Yes, indeed. And Nadia Bilbassy-Charters, Al Arabiya's Washington bureau chief in Riyadh. It was such a pleasure to talk to you. I hope you join me again soon. Thank you so much. To London now, where Downing Street have confirmed that the UK Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, will travel to Washington next week for talks with US President Donald Trump. It's thought the Prime Minister will seek to deepen the special relationship on his first visit to DC since Trump's inauguration, with the wars in Israel and Ukraine likely to be on the agenda. Starmer was in Paris earlier today and described the European summit as a once-in-a-generation moment for national security. Here's what he had to say.
We're facing a generational challenge when it comes to national security. Obviously, the immediate question is the future of Ukraine, and we must continue to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position, whatever happens next, and to make sure that if there is peace, and we all want peace, that it is lasting. I think there's a bigger piece here as well, which is that this isn't just about the front line in Ukraine, it's the front line of Europe and of the United Kingdom. It's about our national security, and I think that we need to do more, we need to step up.
Our correspondent in London, Ollie Barrett, has been following the story.
Well, this is the first time that the UK Prime Minister has explicitly made it clear that he would be in favour of sending UK troops to be involved in some kind of peacekeeping force in Ukraine if there were to be a peace deal. He describes it as a generational challenge for Europe, but he is also stressing that the UK believes that there would need to be United States security guarantees involved in any such arrangement as well. The opposition Conservatives here in the UK say that they are cautious about the idea, but generally would back it, it seems, and the former Conservative Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has said that he is very strongly in favour of such a role for the UK in Ukraine. Downing Street is not wanting to be drawn yet on exact details, how many troops the UK might be prepared to commit. For example, a spokesperson for the Prime Minister today saying that Downing Street didn't want to get ahead of this conversation, given that there isn't yet a peace deal and that therefore details can't yet be fully hammered out about exactly what role the UK might play. All of this comes amid ongoing debate in this country, as there is in several other European countries, about defence spending. The UK currently spends a little over 2% of GDP on defence. It has an ambition to get to 2.5%, but the UK government, led by Keir Starmer, hasn't yet set out exactly when and how it is going to make that jump. Also, it has been confirmed today that Keir Starmer will go to Washington for talks with Donald Trump at some point next week, and when he's there, you would expect that he'll be able to convey some of the messaging that comes out of the summit in Paris today that's being held by French President Emmanuel Macron, which Keir Starmer is attending. Certainly Downing Street is hopeful and believes that the UK can play something of a bridging role between the European continent and the new Washington Trump administration that has a slightly different position when it comes to Ukraine than the previous Biden administration. Whether or not that is something that the UK and Keir Starmer can actually achieve very much remains to be seen. But that is, I think, the hope of Downing Street at this point, as it confirms that Keir Starmer will be heading to Washington next week to meet with Donald Trump.
Ollie Barrett in London, thank you. Staying with the Ukraine peace talks, and President Zelensky has been in the UAE as momentum builds for a truce between Russia and Ukraine. Zelensky's office has said he plans to focus on investments and economic partnerships for his country, as well as a large-scale humanitarian program. President Zelensky will travel to Saudi Arabia later this week. We are now joined by Dr. Oleksandr Merezhko, a Ukrainian MP who heads up the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Ukrainian Parliament. Dr. Oleksandr, an absolute pleasure to have you on this evening. Today, Europe is holding a summit on Ukraine in Paris, and thousands of miles away in Riyadh, Russia and the US officials will be meeting to discuss Ukraine too. How are you and your fellow government ministers feeling about both separate meetings? And do you have hope?
Well, we remain hopeful. We hope that the new administration of President Trump will continue to support Ukraine for a very simple reason, because it's in the best national interests of the United States to maintain global peace and order. We're also hopeful with regard to our European partners, our European allies, and this meeting, which will take place in Paris, this is about how to continue to support Ukraine and what should be a common position of European countries if negotiations with regard to Ukraine will start. Also, additionally, we have official visit of our President Volodymyr Zelensky, first to United Arab Emirates and then to Saudi Arabia. These are official visits which have been planned long before. So, and there is no kind of coincidence in this regard.
And I just want to say, we're told Zelensky will travel to Saudi Arabia this week, as you said. It's unclear if he will actually meet the US delegation. There's some uneasiness about Trump speaking to Putin on the phone before he called Zelensky. How is that situation between the US and Zelensky currently? And is his trip to Saudi a real sign that Ukraine needs to be taken seriously?
Ukraine is taken seriously by the United States, and I hope that the United States and the new president will continue to follow the principle, extremely important principle, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. At the same time, we understand that the United States might have with Russia their own track, their own issues to discuss. But what really matters is that no decision with regard to the fate of Ukraine should be taken behind our back.
What are the requests of Ukraine in order to agree to a permanent ceasefire with Russia?
There are several red lines about which no compromise can and should be reached. I mean by these red lines, first of all, our territorial integrity, and there cannot be any territorial concessions on the part of Ukraine because our territorial integrity is in our constitution. The second issue, this is about our future and the most reliable guarantee of our survival and our security, which is full-fledged membership in NATO. And this issue, NATO membership, should not be even discussed by anyone with Putin. Putin should not dictate Ukraine whether or not to join a particular international organization, like, for example, NATO.
During Munich Security Council, President Zelensky has suggested that Europe needs to create its very own army. How doable is this, and would Ukraine prefer to join a potential European alliance instead of NATO to protect its sovereignty? Because we heard Pete Hegseth there saying that NATO is kind of out of the question for Ukraine.
Well, even though some might be hesitant or reluctant about our membership, but we're not going to take no as an answer because we're talking about our survival. And NATO membership is the only deterrent with regard to Putin's aggression. That's why we'll continue to insist on our membership, because this is about our life and death. At the same time, as a temporary or additional security measure, we might consider creation of army of the European Union. Why not? President Trump, long before, has put forward this idea. And I would like to remind the audience that there is a common foreign policy and common defense policy within the European Union. So within this framework, we can develop this idea about creating European army.
Dr. Oleksandr Merezhko, who heads up the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Ukrainian Parliament. I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at the top business news. Japan's fourth quarter GDP has beat forecasts as consumption and business spending does pick up. Preliminary data out earlier today showed the country's economy expanded 2.8% in the October-December quarter, beating expectations. The latest growth momentum could shore up the BOJ's case for more interest rate hikes. South Korea has banned new downloads of China's DeepSeek artificial intelligence chatbot over privacy concerns. That's according to the country's personal data protection watchdog. The government says the AI model will become available again when improvements and remedies are made to ensure it complies with South Korea's personal data protection laws. Let's go to sports news now. And Sweden's Ludvig Åberg had a sensational victory at the Genesis Invitational. The 25-year-old holed 4 birdies in his final 6 holes to claim his second PGA Tour, which moves him to 4th in the world rankings. He finished a stroke clear of Maverick McNeely after a tight tussle at Torrey Pines over in San Diego. And the Manchester United boss, Ruben Amorim, says his job is so hard after a defeat at Tottenham left his side 15th in the Premier League. The manager oversaw an 8th loss in 12 league games as Tottenham's 13th-minute goal gave them the victory. Amorim is having to contend with a 12-man injury list. Now, a reminder of our top stories. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio touches down in Saudi Arabia for high-profile peace talks to end the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, European leaders hold emergency discussions in Paris as they react to the US diplomatic strategy on the conflict. The UK government confirms Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer will head to Washington next week to meet with US President Donald Trump. And President Zelensky will travel to Saudi Arabia this week, days after his trip to the UAE, as he demands a seat at the negotiation table. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you so much for joining us. Coming up next, Hadley Gamble's interviews with Prince Turki Al Faisal, the former Saudi spy chief, and the Latvian president, followed by special interviews with the CEO of Dow Jones and the UK Science and Technology Secretary. Plus, don't miss Tom Burgess-Watson with GNT. A lot to watch this evening after me. Good night and enjoy.